All right, welcome back to another episode of the White Oak Collective Podcast. I'm running this one solo again. Austin is in Nebraska hunting turkeys. He sent me a picture this morning, so they're having a little luck up there. And I wish I was with them, but instead I'm here podcasting. But got brought another Austin in to take his place. So this is the second time I've had a guess that I should have done this before we started recording. But Austin, how do you pronounce your last name? Is it Delano or Delano?
I go by anything, but yeah, Delano.
Okay, Delano. So I've got Austin Delano with Mossy Oak here to kind of talk about food plots and summer food plots. Since it's that time of year, everybody's kind of got that on their mind. But Austin, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. So if you want to just get it started, kind of go into what you do for Mossy Oak, what your job is there, and I guess any kind of background that you want to give us.
Yeah, man. Yeah, so I work for our biologic and gamekeepers divisions. Which we've got a lot going on under the Mossy Oak umbrella. So I've been with biologic and gamekeepers since going back to 2006, I believe. So pretty long run I've had here. I really like what I do. Get to do a little bit of something different every day for the most part, but my main responsibilities are basically building our seed blends that we put on store shelves with biologic, and then obviously the website, and making sure we get the best seed possible for all the blends we build. And I do a lot of R&D on researching what's new and what's out there that we can do to improve blends for our customers. And I do a lot of soil sample reading for guys, helping them with soil sample results and herbicide recommendations, fertilizer recommendations, and just overall habitat improvement questions. So a lot of customer service work and a lot of sitting in front of a computer, and also a lot of time in the field, when the time is right, which we're getting into that time of year where there's no end to the amount of things that you can do right now as far as chores on a farm. So a lot of field time coming up here in the next couple of months, and really all through the warm growing season headed into the fall. So that's really my main responsibilities, at Biologic, is building our seed blends and doing a lot of customer work, just making sure we keep the best blends possible on the store shelves, and all the questions that entail making sure guys are growing the best crops possible.
Yeah. So how'd you get to that position? Are you a biologist by trade, or just kind of farmed, or how'd you get to where you're at?
Yeah, I guess my background would be I've kind of worked, my first job was on a farm, stomping cotton wagons and putting levee gates in rice fields out in Arkansas, and I live in North Alabama now. I've been here since 95. Was actually born out west in New Mexico, so I've kind of made the rounds, but been here in North Alabama, right up here in the northwest corner. I can throw a rock off my property and hit Tennessee, so I'm as far in the corner as you can get up here in the Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama corner. And I went to school for forestry, and so was most likely fixing to transfer to some bigger universities after I had a couple of years of forestry school in, and ended up getting a job running a privately owned wildlife management area back in the 2001 time range, and then went to work for Mossy Oak in 06. And I've been doing my own, little consulting gig, since I got out of school, really. Just mostly for people around the house here, whether it's farming, consulting on crops, or timberland, timber stand improvement type projects. So I've had my hand in a lot of ag and a lot of forestry, and obviously food plots are kind of right there in the middle of all that. So this is kind of all I've ever done.
So you kind of just got into it by trial and error, and getting out there and actually doing it and figuring it out, and right in the middle of it.
Yeah, people ask me all the time, it's like, how'd you ever figure all this stuff out? I was like, because I've done it the wrong way. I spent a lot of time with trial and error. I mean, it's a great teacher. You know, it's not always pleasant. It can be painful and expensive, but yeah, it's a great teacher because you don't usually forget those lessons when you make them yourself.
Yeah,
So you know,
and with
that's
seed
one
and
thing I
stuff.
really like to do. Make sure our customers don't make those mistakes. You know, so we can, you know, help them to be as cost efficient as possible, and when they're putting these plots in.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was going to say. When it comes to fertilizer and seed and all that, these mistakes can get expensive quick. So you don't want to make them
No
more than
doubt.
once if you can keep from it.
No
So
doubt.
it's that time of year. Everybody's either planted their plots or their summer plots, or they're getting ready to. I know over here, since I don't, I try not to think too much about it until May 1st when turkey season's over. But um, now that's kind of all I'm thinking about. And I've got a couple different ideas, but go into, I guess, the importance of summer plots for a management plan or for a piece of property, and then we'll kind of go into what your favorite plantings or blends or stuff like that is.
Yeah, it's you know, spring plots, spring and summer. You know, warm season plots are way more popular, I guess if that's a word, now than they were years ago. You know, a lot more education is available out there through podcasts and just all the info on the web about, you know, if you're truly trying to grow uh, bigger and healthier deer, and you just want more wildlife on your property in general, you know, you can't leave out, you know, the biggest growing season of all, which is, you know, the warm growing season. So, you know, if you're particularly talking about, you know, whitetails, you really can't miss out on trying to get some really good high protein nutrient filled groceries in their belly right now when they're starting to grow antlers. You know, your does are, you know, carrying sometimes two fawns inside of them, one for sure most of the time, and you know, it takes a lot out of the body to grow all that. And if we want to see bigger and healthier deer, you got to make sure they've got some really good food sources during this key part of the year. You know, from late April all the way into early September when they get done shedding that velvet. So it's an important time to, you know, I really encourage guys to, you know, take a step back, look at what your goals and objectives are for whatever piece of property you have, whether it's, you know, you've got two plots on your granddad's back 40 and you just want to see some deer in there using it during the spring and summer and hopefully get some bigger, you know, bigger antler growth out of the deer that are using the place and encouraging more deer to use the place, or, you know, whether you're planting, you know, seed producing blends for turkey and, you know, trying to encourage quail to use the place. A lot of that stuff needs to be thought of, you know, right now in early May, instead of all of a sudden it gets into August and be like, man, I wish we'd have planted some beans, or I wish we'd have done something.
Yeah.
So, you know, figure out what the goals and objectives you've got, because, you know, I talk with a little bit of everybody. I talk from the guy that's got 1 acre of food plots, and you know, I help a guy out that's got, you know, 1,500 acres, and he's got 50 acres of food plots on that farm. You know, so that there's somebody on the spectrum everywhere, and everybody's important to me. You know, just because you've only got 1 acre does not make you any less important than the guy that's got, you know, 50 acres to deal with. I want everybody to be successful at you know, growing their best crops. You know, is what I kind of the saying I like to use all the time. Just growing the best crop you can for the situation you've got. So goals and objectives are great because, like you're talking about, the expense of all this and the time that it takes to do it, you just don't want to fly into it and just kind of half-hearted. I'd rather see guys, you know, pour their attention into a few food plots and really make sure they do well with those, you know, 1, 2, or 3, however many it is, than trying to do 20 but not doing any of them but 10 or 15%. You know, let's make sure the ones that you do pour your time into, you know, get everything they need.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot on here, with whether it be for stuff like this, for trapping, for burning, whatever. It's like it doesn't matter. You do it on the scale that you can do it. You might not, you know, trapping. It's all the time. People say, you know, unless you can do it on a large scale consistently. Well, if you can't, that doesn't mean don't do it at all. So it's all
Right.
about, you know, you do it to the best that you can, regardless of what you got. Um, So last year I planted, and last year was my first year really going into summer plots or spring summer plots. Um, and I did some beans, and I think I mixed some cowpeas in there, a couple different things, just kind of a blend that I made myself. But as far as biologic is concerned, and you're concerned, what's your, if you just got a blank slate property, I guess that you hadn't had previous experience with, what would your go-to be for a warm season plot?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really one of the first things I usually do is look at the property, see what's available on it currently, and also what are the surrounding resources. What am I going to be dealing with here before I put a plan into action? If I've got a piece of property and they've got, it's a 500 acre piece of property and they've got 5 plots and they're 5 acres each, an acre each, and so they got 5 acres worth of food plots, and they've got a really high deer density and it's all in the middle of big timber, I'm going to take for granted we're going to have a lot of pressure on those 5 acres worth of plots.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has a high deer density, but a good many people, I've got a lease across the line in Tennessee. Our deer numbers are through the roof. We can kill 3 does a day every day of the season legally. Obviously nobody can do that, but it just goes to show you the deer density is high, and we have a little bit of ag around us. It's not a lot, but it's a little bit. But even in those places where it's a 15 acre bean field here and a 20 acre bean field over here, when you see 2 acres get eaten out of the corner of every bean field down to to your ankles, use those clues to let you know, hey, putting in a half-acre soybean plot is probably not going to be the best thing I can do, because they're going to overbrowse it before it ever has a chance to get up and actually produce a lot of food for me. And I'm going to be sitting there 3 weeks after planting, and it's going to look like I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So that's one of the first things I do, is look at the surrounding resources and kind of what's going on in that particular area as far as the number of deer we're going to be trying to feed, and what are their other choices, that they're going to be pulled to, that is going to make a difference in what I choose to plant. Obviously, soybeans are a great, warm season food for whitetails. They flat out love them almost too much, which is why a lot of people have a lot of failures with soybeans. Is A, they have too many deer, and B, they don't have enough acreage, and a lot of times both.
Yeah.
It's a very common problem, and deer just love soybeans so much right out of the ground that when that soybean plant has not, reached the trifoliate stage and really hadn't branched out and started doing a whole lot yet, and that terminal bud gets nipped off, that plant's dead. And it's going to look like you didn't do anything, and if you don't have like a utilization cage up or something to show just how many deer are using that plot, you're going to be like, man, I don't think my seed was any good, or I didn't plant it right, or, so I say all that to say, really look at what your situation is before you just say, I'm going to plant this.
Mm-hmm.
In higher deer density areas, I really like using peas. We have a protein pea blend, we call it. It's got iron and clay peas and what's called a mung bean in it, which is not really a soybean. It grows a whole lot more like a pea. So it teams up with iron and clay pea really good. I really like using those on even moderate deer density areas, and especially high deer density areas, because they don't seem to love them right out of the ground like they do a soybean, which is great because it gives it some time to get up, get some growth to it, and get established before the deer fly in there and start, wearing it out. And it's, super high protein. The nutrient density in it is incredible for whitetails, and it'll grow on some, pretty poor sites. Your soil doesn't have to be in just tip-top condition to still grow a really good, field full of nutritious pea forage all through the spring and summer. And they love the heat. A lot of my plots last year, I don't know about y'all, but we didn't get the rainfall like I would have liked to last year, and peas just do an incredible job about hanging on in a lot of heat, not very much moisture, a pretty diverse type soils, whether it's sandy or clay or loam in between. They do really good in a lot of situations with just a little bit of fertility. So I'm a huge fan of peas and putting those in, where I know deer are going to come in there and use it, especially in that mid-June through early September time period. That's when they really, your woody browse in the woods that the deer are really sucked in on right now, because there's all this fresh, new green growth out there, honeysuckles and just all the good native forage that they key in on. A lot of that stuff, especially in the South, as you get into July, the quality of it starts to head downhill. They've browsed off a lot of the new stuff that's come out, and they're kind of, whitetails are just off looking for the next best thing. And so that's when they usually start really keying in on those peas, is in the hottest and most difficult part of the year for growing crops. So it kind of teams up good too if you can get those planted, right here in the first couple of weeks of May, while we still got some pretty consistent rain coming in, and go ahead and get them up and get them out of the ground. And you've got a lot of green forage in the woods that can kind of take the pressure off of those plots, so that they're not just on them, as soon as you put them in the ground, which sometimes happens with guys when they don't plant a warm season plot until the middle of July or first week of August. All of a sudden it's the best thing out there right then, and they fly in there on it. And if you've got a pretty good deer density and not a lot of acreage, they can kind of over-browse it before it has a chance to get up and kind of do its thing. So a huge fan of the peas. Obviously maintaining clover this time of year is big too. If you put your clover in, this past fall, and it's up out of the ground and kind of really starting to hit its stride for that first growing season, I really like to baby it right here in the back half of spring, when things are really starting to take off. Make sure I got my weeds under control, soil sample and hit it with some fertilizer if I need to make sure it gets really good and thick, and weed free for the most part heading into the summer. That way, if we go through a 6 or 8 week dry spell, it's got a root system established that even if it gets down to just bare dirt through August, going into September, that it's going to be able to jump back out of the ground when the cooler weather sets in.
Yeah. So what are you, we're kind of going, I'm going to jump over to that and we'll come back to the summer blends and stuff, but what are you spraying on your clover right now? Are you killing, say you mix it with some wheat and oats and stuff, are you killing all that right now?
It kind of depends.
Clover plots?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I almost always recommend, starting your clover, if you're in the Midwest, South, doesn't really matter where you're at. If you're starting your clover for the first time in the late part of the summer, if you're in the Midwest, or if you're down in the, early part of the fall down here in the South, I always add a little bit of a cereal grain to it. Whether I use like our Green Patch Plus blend that's got a lot of grains in there with it, as kind of a nurse crop to give those deer something to browse on, because those annuals are going to come up so much faster than a perennial clover does. That perennial is not just going to blow out of the ground real fast like an annual does. And so I kind of want to give my deer something to browse on while that clover's, getting established. And also when it goes through the winter and gets that root system established, and then it really comes back the following spring, all those cereal grains usually come flushing out with it pretty strong. And so a lot of people are like, man, I don't know what to do. I've got wheat and oats and they look great and they're starting to, head out. So you got several choices. You can spray it obviously with a grass selective herbicide like clethodim and kill those grasses, the wheat and oats, since they're in the grass family. I really go and take a little bit of, an inventory on the fields and be like, okay, I don't really have any invasive grasses in here. I just have wheat and oats coming back. And if that's the case, I'll usually mow, before I think turkeys are nesting, which is going to be pretty early. And that's going to kind of set back or in a lot of cases terminate that wheat and oat. Some of it's going to come back, some of it's not. It really depends on how heavily you planted that, wheat and oats back during the fall. I mean, if you put it in there at a full rate of 100+ pounds per acre, your clover can be jamming underneath it, but those wheat and those oats look like they're just taking over the field. And when those mature and make seed here in the next few weeks, it's incredible turkey food and pretty good nesting habitat. Obviously, we find a lot of turkeys that like to nest right down in that clover when they've got kind of that cover. To us it's short, to them it's tall because it's over their head by then. so what I'll do a lot of times is maybe leave the perimeter of my fields in the wheat and oats and let it just come on up and head out and mature and have that seed sitting there. It's going to produce seed that the turkeys are going to use. B, there's cover there, but it's also a lot of insects. You know, a lot of insects get on those wheat and oats as they start going into that doughy stage and making their seed head, and that's just added food for our turkeys. So I usually don't try to terminate the entire field as far as wheat and oats go, unless I've got a spot where I've got a lot of invasive grasses that I know I'm already seeing them, or early spring coming out of the ground. If you got a lot of shatter cane or Johnson grass or ryegrass, a lot of people deal with a lot of ryegrass that people put in years ago and they let it go to seed, and then in the springtime it all flushes back out and it looks like you planted ryegrass all over again. So in that case, I'm definitely going to get in there pretty early in the spring or right now even, and get a grass selective herbicide sprayed and get those grass competitions knocked out of that clover. That way it has a chance to really get filled in and get full and lush heading into the summertime.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of goes into, you were talking about part of your, leaving part of the field unmowed and then mowing part of it. And that really goes back to just having a plan for your whole year-round property, not just thinking in segments of, hey, we're doing our summer plots now, then we're doing our fall plots. You kind of need to think about it all, how it's going to carry into each other year-round. So if you were...
I really...
Go ahead.
I really just try to encourage guys that, I'm a perfectionist about a lot of things, and like seeing weeds in a food plot drives me crazy, but your food plot doesn't have to be completely weed free. I'm not one to run out there and spray the entire plot just because I see a little something popping up over here and over there. But I don't want invasives coming there and taking over, which is what happens to a lot of guys. They go through the time and the expense of putting in a perennial clover in the fall, and then they kind of forget about it. They'll see it during turkey season, like, man, that clover's looking great, and then turkey season's over with, and they may not come back in there for another month or two, and you come back and you've got Johnson grass head tall or foxtail, up to your chest, and you're like, holy cow. So it's preventative maintenance, but I'm not going to run in there and spray an entire field just because I see a little bit of a problem here and there. But, I don't want all my hard work going to waste when, you've got a lot of invasives that can take over and just absolutely ruin a plot in a matter of a couple of months.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of going back to the summer planting, but talking about spraying and stuff, when you're going to plant the peas or the mung beans or whatever, are you spraying a glyphosate or something on your plot? Are you killing everything before you plant it, or what are you doing there?
Yeah, if I've got a field where I'm going to be putting in, like Game Changer Forward soybeans or our protein peas, an all legume blend, I'm usually going to go in there with a non-selective, generic glyphosate and get that area burned down so that I'm planting into a good weed-free, seed bed. And it also depends on if I'm going to be no-tilling that field or if I'm going to be using, traditional tillage, with a disc or a tiller or some type of a cultivator to work the dirt, because if you go in there and disturb that soil in the warm season, you're going to get a flush of weeds. That's a guarantee. Some places are worse than others, and everybody's got different weeds in their soil profile depending on, you can disc a field up 1 week and then disc a field up a month later, and a different type of weed's going to flush up because of soil temperature and all these other variables. So, if you've got a lot of heavy weed pressure on your farm, I'm going to be doing traditional tillage, to work my ground up with a disc or a tiller. I'm probably going to go in there and burn down before I work the ground for a couple of reasons. One, you're going to make a lot less passes with your disc or your tiller when you're working up dead, crispy vegetation. If you're trying to work in 2.5 foot deep worth of green weeds, unless you've got some really big farm equipment, you're going to make 50 passes before you feel like you've got a nice clean seed bed to work with. Another reason is you eat up some of your nitrogen reserves, what little you may have, and just kind of the overall energy in your soil right there. When you work all that green vegetation in and your soil is kind of trying to decompose all that while you've got fresh seeds in there that are trying to germinate. So I don't want to take away from seeds I put in, and my soil sitting there trying to, decompose and digest, 2.5 foot worth of, green vegetation that I just rolled in there with all my soil.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I generally burn down first, and then I give it a week. And now, make a week, 10 days, make sure it gets good and brown and crispy, work my ground, get in there and plant. And a lot of times, if I know I'm going to have weed pressure afterwards, let's say it's something like protein peas or iron and clay peas where it's not Roundup ready, but there are herbicides you can use over the top of it. You just got to be a little bit more, creative about what you use. You could use clethodim for grasses just like you use on your clover because it's a legume. So the peas and beans are very tolerant of grass herbicides. Or if I know I'm going to have a lot of broadleaf weed problems based on the history and what's growing around it, I'm probably going to put down a pre-emerge. Something like a dual magnum or something that is going to hold back that weed pressure, for a month or 2 months, depending on rainfall, letting those peas or those beans get up and get out of the ground and get kind of canopied out a little bit before the weeds have a chance to take off and take back over the field. So another big reason why you got to have a little bit of a plan before you, fly into planting something. That way you don't get surprised by, oh man, I wish we'd have sprayed this or, done that. And I try to be very, conservative about my herbicide usage. I don't want to just spray every time something pops up. It's deadgum expensive. We all know that, but it's also very time consuming, So having a plan of what you, foresee is probably going to happen on a place with your history on it or what neighbors around you deal with, the guys that farm next to you, they can usually give you a pretty good idea of what you're going to deal with if you work the ground up. Hey, you're probably going to have pigweed or you're going to have a bunch of water hemp. Your farmers around you can give you a lot of good insight on what you're probably going to deal with if you, work a field up and plant it the traditional way. Obviously, like our Roundup Ready Forward soybeans are really, really popular because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of what a guy should spray. He knows, hey, I can plant these beans, and if I get a big old flush of grass and broadleaf, I can go right back over the top with a, generic glyphosate and keep it clean and make sure that, crop has a chance to take off and do what it's capable of doing without a lot of weed competition taking over.
Yeah. So I know you, since you kind of said that the pea would be your go-to, just on a, something, a farm that you don't know a ton about going into it or whatever. Talking about fertilizer, what are you going to do there? I mean, I know you need to get a soil sample, but with the peas, because the peas are nitrogen, they make their own nitrogen, correct?
Correct. Yeah, they're a legume.
Yeah. So what are you doing as far as fertilizer there for them?
Yeah, like you said, I'm always going to lean on a soil sample, and if a guy doesn't have one, that's current, within the last couple of years, man, I usually grab one right then and there, sends it off. Our lab over in Memphis processes them super quick. I can send them one on a Monday, get it to them. They'll probably have it on a Wednesday, and by Friday, I know what my dirt's got, and what it doesn't have. And that's what I tell a lot of people is a soil sample not only is it going to tell me what's currently going on there as far as my pH level and my nutrient status on my phosphorus, potassium, magnesium and calcium. I'm going to know what's in there, and I'm also going to know what I already have. As far as it's going to show me my deficiencies, but it's also going to show, hey, you've already got, plenty of phosphorus and potassium in the field. You're pretty good, but your pH is really low. So in that case, I'm going to try to go ahead and get my lime, spread and incorporated. So the soil sample goes a long way so that we're not just doing guesswork on throwing, fertilizer into the wind, because there's 100 different types of blends of fertilizer out there that are, they've all got their uses. You just want to make sure you're picking the right one. And like you said, with peas or beans or any other legume you're planting, with them being nitrogen producers themselves, going into the warm season, you don't really want to be spreading a bunch of nitrogen out there, because that's really just going to lead to kind of fuel for your weeds. Not to say that you can't use a little bit of nitrogen to get a legume started, but I'm not going to go in there with the same type of nitrogen, input that I would if I was growing corn or sorghum or something like that. So, I'm usually going to be looking at using something like if we're looking at bag type fertilizers like a 0-20-20, or maybe a 5-20-20, which has got just a little bit of nitrogen in it, so that we're not just laying a bunch of nitrogen out there for, all our weeds to eat up and make them, get a steroid shot. So soil samples are the way to go so that we're not guessing. But phosphorus and potassium are your two major components, your macronutrients that all legumes need, and they're really going to thrive off of it when you've got it up there in that optimum range.
Yeah, and that's the thing, talking about spraying, but especially with fertilizer, you could just be wasting your money throwing something out there that you've already got plenty of, and fertilizer is not cheap at all. So
yeah, the fertilizer bill every year on a farm can get pretty out of hand. So that's one reason I really encourage guys, hey, get you a $10 soil sample, because it may save you hundreds or thousands, so that you're not out there spreading the wrong thing just because you're like, heck, I don't know, just mix me up this. Well, not only do I not want to, not only do we want to make sure we're putting out there what we do need and what we are deficient in, we don't want to be over applying a nutrient that we've already got plenty of in the soil. Because some soils have a lot of certain nutrients naturally already in them, and if you're already kind of in an optimum range, we don't want to be throwing a bunch of extra of it out there to go on top. Especially over time, you could lead to some actually creating a toxic environment for plants where, you've got too much of one thing out there, and it's just as bad as not having enough of it.
Yeah. Well, so you just kind of mentioned corn for a second when you were talking about the fertilizer, and so I want to just jump into it because Mac Thatcher is the one that put us together, and he actually sent me a bag of y'all's corn. I've grown corn in the backyard, but I've never grown corn. I know it's not going to be technically a summer plot. It's going to be producing towards the fall, but what's some help on trying to grow some corn? And I'll say growing corn with just your traditional deer camp type implements, where you're not out there with legitimate farm equipment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we actually shot a video that your listeners can probably look up on YouTube. Heck, it's been 7-8 years ago, maybe longer. I lose track of time, but we shot a video right when we came out with this wildlife sweet corn blend that you're talking about, just for the average guy. I am the average guy, so I don't have a corn planter sitting in my backyard. Can I go find one? Yeah, I could probably go borrow one, but for the most guys, they're going to be using, traditional deer camp type equipment. Maybe they've got a disc, probably got a sprayer, and might have a cultivator or, some stuff like that. So there's definite ways to plant corn and be successful without having a bunch of sophisticated equipment. Corn can kind of be a little bit finicky to grow, in that a lot of people just don't realize that it really needs nitrogen. Okay, is it going to grow without it? Yes, but we really need to give it a little bit of nitrogen to make sure we create an environment where it can do what it's capable of doing. Obviously, our other nutrients are important too, but we got to make sure we get some nitrogen out there at least when you first plant, to make sure it's got some to get started and get up out of the ground strong, and not get in a stressed out period real early on. For some kind of rules to look at on planting corn with traditional, like, broadcasting type equipment instead of a no-till drill or a corn planter. Corn needs to be deep. There's variables, but your corn doesn't need to be laying on top of the ground. Yeah. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of pests that eat corn that's laying on top of the ground. Crows will rob you blind, and every other bird that sees it laying there. But your germination rate will be pretty poor if it's just laying right there on the soil surface. So whatever you do to work your soil up, whether it's a disc or a tiller or some type of harrow, we want to make sure that when we broadcast our corn in a traditional planting sense, that we get back in there and cover it a little bit. An inch and a half deep is fine. Even if you get it down 2 inches, it's probably going to be just fine. It's going to germ. Corn will germ down there at 2 inches where a lot of stuff won't. I would much rather have my corn 1.5 inches deep than sitting there 1/4 inch deep. Yeah. So whatever you do and whatever you have available to you, give that corn some coverage, whether it's pulling a harrow back over the top of it or setting your disc straight, and pulling some dirt back over the top of it. And then I'm probably going to come back in there and either pull a cultipacker over the top of it or a roller, or just use my tractor tires to firm all that seed bed back up, especially if I disked it pretty deep or tilled it pretty deep where you've got, 6-7 inches of kind of fluffy soil. I don't want it staying that way. I'm going to get back in there and firm that seed bed back up, so my rainfall moves through the soil profile the same across the field as possible, because if it's all still real fluffy and has a lot of airspace in it, you'll get a big heavy rain. You'll have some areas that hold water and then some areas that don't, and your corn can kind of be spotty. You'll have some areas where it comes up really well and then some areas where it doesn't. So if I did some type of traditional tillage and I get my seed covered back up, I'm usually going to go back in there and use something to roll or press the field back down, firm, to make sure all that seed's kind of sealed off and not sitting there in a bunch of, fluffy, soil with a lot of air around it.
Yeah.
You'll also see a lot better germination rates that way, because if you do run into a situation where you get, one good rain and then it sits there for 2 or 3 weeks without another one, you don't want that seed kind of just sitting there where it had enough moisture to germ and get the process started, but that loose soil around it kind of dries out quicker. So all that to say, I usually want to pull something back over the plot, even if it's just going over it with a drag, several times, and just making sure my tire, pressure and everything firms that seed bed back up. Obviously, weed control is a big deal with corn. So after you've got it planted, you've got some options. Our corn in particular, is what we consider a conventional corn. It is not Roundup ready. So just like peas and beans, there's a lot of good chemistry out there to use to keep your corn clean. It's just not going to be glyphosate.
Yeah.
So you can put down a pre-emerge. There's some great pre-emerges out there that work on conventional corn. Obviously, atrazine is one that's been used for decades. It still gets used even on, glyphosate-tolerant corn because it does such a good job of giving you, sometimes 2 months worth of good, clean, soil that doesn't, germ a whole bunch of weed seeds after you went in there and worked the dirt up, that you end up, with your corn's looking great, but then all of a sudden the weeds are just catching up to it, and you're like, oh, this is conventional corn. What do I spray over it now? So atrazine is very helpful. It's fairly inexpensive as herbicides go, and it really does work good. You have an option of using it until your corn is about 12 inches tall. You can read labels and get really specific on it, but you can use atrazine all the way up to about, a foot in height on conventional corn before it's a little bit too old to be going over the top of it with a herbicide like that. So I'm usually going to almost always put some type of pre-emerge down if I want my corn to stay pretty weed-free through that first couple of months of the growing season.
Yeah.
And then my fertilizer, I'm going to fertilize, as best I can according to a soil test. One thing I tell guys is, when you get a soil test back and it shows you how many pounds of each nutrient that you're really needing, a lot of times those samples are saying, here's what you would need to grow, an optimum yield of corn. So if you look at your soil sample and you're like, man, I can't afford that much fertilizer, get some down. Some is going to be better than not going after it at all. And you don't have to put, 300 units of nitrogen out there on conventional corn to have a successful, wildlife plot. But we do want to give it some. We want it to have some energy and some growth, So look at your soil sample, see what it says you need, and at least get, half of what is called for, if not close to 3/4 of what your nutrient status is showing that you need to grow that corn, because it does not do real well in unfertile ground. There's some crops that still make really well, like the peas. They just don't have to have great ground to still be pretty successful. Corn is not always that. It's pretty finicky sometimes.
Yeah.
So you don't have to have super fertile ground to grow it, but you do want to know what you're dealing with when you go into planting it. So you say, okay, I'm going to put this amount down now. at planting time, and maybe come back in, if possible, it kind of depends on rainfall, but somewhere around that 5 or 6 week mark, and come back and give it another shot of nitrogen, whether that's just a liquid nitrogen over the top, or if you're going back in there and hand spreading it with a hand spreader. Some of the best cornfields I've ever grown, even though I've done a bunch of ag corn too, but some of the best kind of wildlife corn pockets that I've ever grown have been traditionally planted with a disc and broadcasting the seed, covering it up, going back in there and packing my soil back down pretty firm, making sure I've got some type of a pre-emerge down, and after my initial dose of fertilizer, getting back in there when that corn's about 18 inches tall and giving it a follow-up shot of nitrogen.
Yeah.
If you can do that right before a rainfall, go in there with urea, which is 4600. Go back in there with some urea, a day or two before a really good rain. Man, you'll be able to hear that corn grow. I mean, it's an absolute steroid shot for it, and it really thrives off of it and makes sure it doesn't get into a stressed out period where it kind of runs out of fuel. And I don't want a couple bags of fertilizer not being spread to be the reason I didn't grow as good a corn as I could have,
Yeah. So, and that's the urea is what I think that's what the bag calls for if you don't have a soil sample, isn't it?
Yeah, and see, nitrogen, whether you're using the urea form, which is 4600, or ammonium nitrate, which is 3400, some people's is 33, depending on what state you live in. Your soil doesn't really hold on to a lot of nitrogen like it does your other nutrients. Mm-hmm. So when you get a soil sample back, it's not going to usually give you what your nitrogen content is. What it's going to tell you is, which is one reason we ask what you're planning to plant before you send your sample in, because if you're planting peas or beans, I'm not going to suggest we put a lot of nitrogen, if any, down. But if we're planting corn or sorghum, something that I know loves nitrogen, I'm going to say, okay, we're going to try to give this corn this many units at planting and this many units as a follow-up, or I'm going to try to put the whole load of nitrogen down, right when I plant, because I'm not going to be able to get back in there on it. So nitrogen is something that is almost always needed in any type of, monocot or grass family plant. So I just usually look at what can I afford and what's going to be a, kind of middle of the road, and what's a high end, shot of nitrogen going to look like for the size of field I've got. And do I want to put out all of it at once when I plant, or do I want to split it up and put some out at planting and put some out, when it's a foot or 18 inches tall.
Yeah, I know that corn, everything loves corn. So is there a minimum size field that you would want to, before, if you don't fool with corn, if you've got just this much acreage or something like that?
Yeah, corn's, like you said, we're not relying on the corn to be feeding our deer through the spring and the summer, mm-hmm. but it's the time of year we got to be growing it and kind of babying it along. So, I'd usually say an acre, and let's try to keep it an acre or better, just so that when the deer find it, they don't eat it all out in a matter of a week or 10 days when they do find it. Mm-hmm. One thing we have seen over the years, and was one of the reasons we're using a traditional or a conventional corn instead of, obviously there's tons of Roundup Ready and glyphosate tolerant varieties of ag corn that's out there available that works great, but the varieties that we use are old varieties. We use Trucker's Favorite and Bloody Butcher and some of these old heirloom varieties of corn that they do have a higher Brix level or sugar content to them than a traditional ag corn. And if you plant them side by side with an ag corn, we have seen a good many instances where the deer kind of gravitate towards these conventional varieties of corn over an ag style. I think it's because their nose tells them what's going to taste best. Mm-hmm. Whitetails have an insane nose on them for eating what's best for them. And I'm not saying ag corn's bad for deer. They eat it every day, every decade. But we have seen the deer kind of gravitate towards these conventional varieties of, what we call a sweet corn over an ag variety just because their nose says it's going to taste better to them. So all that to say, where an acre of ag corn may have been doing you okay in the past for whatever situation you got, you might want to bump it up just a little bit in case they fly in there and decide, hey, this stuff is great, and that's all very dependent too on your other, food sources you got available on that particular place. If you're surrounded by corn, then an acre's probably plenty. You're probably going to be just fine, but if, like we were talking earlier, if you're in a big wood situation or, there's not any food plots around you to speak of, when that corn starts drying down and they find it, they're probably going to be on it pretty hard until they get it cleaned up. So, that's not a real straight answer for you, but it's kind of dependent on, the situation, whether you have a ton of deer or just kind of moderate deer density, and then also what are their other choices going to be when this corn gets, it gets where it's starting to make an ear and they get to where they're going to start liking it when it dries down. My lease in Tennessee last year, our deer density is so bad, especially in the spring and the summer, that our farmers actually lost a good bit of corn last year of the deer eating it before it was ever even close to making an ear. They're just eating the corn plant.
Yeah.
So obviously, you've got an overpopulation problem, at that point, but it's something to think about too if you're thinking about sticking 1 acre worth of corn or less in a spot that's got a ton of deer, because right out of the ground, it's going to be pretty, attractive to them. You just hope that there's other things around it to take the pressure off till it gets up and, gets going so it's not something they're really keyed in on.
Yeah, and that's one thing to pay attention to. I mean, that's the biggest thing around here that we face is there is no farming around here in southeast Mississippi. So that's our biggest thing is there's nothing else around that's getting planted, keeping the deer out of it. But I guess it's important to pay attention to that for the fall because you might need to take out more does than you were planning on taking out if you can't get a summer crop to come up, so or corn or whatever to come up. You may need to adjust what you're planning on killing that year.
That's right. Yeah, it's warm season crops can sometimes be really good indicators for if you need to clean up some deer on your place and get the number of mouths that are using the place trimmed down. I know some places are like, man, we just want more deer. And there's some places like a couple leases I've got where I was like, man, I wish I could share them with you because I've got, we got too many. Like we can't grow the amount of crops that we've got on the small amount of open ground we do have that's tillable for the number of deer we've got. So we have to be really picky about when we plant and what we plant because an acre worth of soybeans on my place would never make it without being fenced off or having some type of structure around it to let it get up and get the growth it needs on it. To handle the browse pressure that it's going to take because they're going to, if they're eating the corn out of ag fields, 20 and 30% and eating the margins out pretty bad, you should know that you're probably going to have a tough time with a 1 or 2 acre soybean field, because it's so attractive to them.
Yeah, and that's where you mentioned exclusion cages earlier. That's where that's so important too, is to actually know that it's getting eaten and not coming up. So.
Yeah, they can really open your eyes sometime about just how many deer are using your place at night when nobody's around and how much they can consume, Yeah.
So I got to ask on that corn because I am going to try to plant it. How is it for table fare? Is it good eating for humans?
It's mighty fine, man. Okay. It really is. Right. I did not grow any last year. A couple years before, I had a couple of pretty good strips of it planted, linear on the edge of some long food plots, where we just put in some long strips, a couple of planter widths wide, and took some home, and it's pretty fine table fare. I'm not going to say I know, but I do know some people too that say it makes some pretty good homegrown whiskey too.
Well, I don't know if I can try that out, but I'm definitely gonna. If I can get some to make a head, I'm definitely gonna take some home and throw it on the grill. So.
Yeah, it's got a different taste to it as far as you'll notice. Now, if you're comparing it to Green Giant that's in the grocery store, it may not taste as sweet as that because that is specially grown corn for that reason, for taste only.
Yeah.
But if you were to go to an ag field and pick out a corn at the right time of year and some of this, you'll notice that this is it's definitely very edible and very safe. And the cool thing about it is the guys that grow this corn for us, they live actually right here in the county that I live in.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of people that grow this corn for seed across the states anymore, because obviously there's not near as much a market for it as there used to be. But there may be more of a market for it now than there was 10 or 15 years ago, because a lot of people are just more interested now in growing, the non-GMO, non-glyphosate tolerant, varieties of corn. And I don't really have an opinion on it either way for people. I have to say neutral on it. Whether my opinion on non-GT corn versus GT is doesn't matter. But there's a lot of people interested in growing corn that is the same type of corn we were growing several decades ago. So it grows a little different. It's not going to be 15 foot tall and have a stalk on it the size of your calf. But it really seems to work well for wildlife, whether you're just using it for a screen or, you're wanting some, dove field food, or like you said, trying to actually put some out there for the deer to enjoy when they find it. I do encourage guys, though, if you plant that wildlife sweet corn, keep a camera on it, because when they do find it, they tend to stay in there on it pretty hard, especially if you start laying it down with a bush hog or something, if your state allows that.
Yeah, and what's the time that it produces a head? How long does it take typically on that corn?
We use 3 different varieties right now in there, and they're all just a tad apart from each other, but only by a few days. But I typically tell guys just to plan on 90 days, 95 days for maturity. Some of them are gonna start maturing a little earlier than that, probably in that 75 to 85 day range. Some of them are going to start, starting to harden off. Some of it's going to take a little bit deeper, closer to 100 type days. But we generally say about a 90-day, average maturity rate on the bag. So just plan on, 3+ months for maturity on it.
Yeah, and I guess if you can get it, basically, I was going to ask how long until it's too late to plant corn, but I guess if you can just squeeze 100 days before frost in there, you're kind of good to go. Or do you don't want to get to where it gets dried out and we don't get as much rain?
Yeah, that's a great point. Same thing with soybeans and peas and other stuff. Nobody says you can't plant all the way into August or heck into September. Depending on just how far south you are. To your point, when we shot a video on this last year, those protein peas or some soybeans, you plant a soybean or some peas the first week of September in the deep south, that's the first place I'm going to want to bow hunt.
Yeah.
Because a young bean or a young pea that's just, a foot tall coming out of the ground, when the deer find that, there's nothing they're going to want more than young, tender beans, But you also have to realize first frost is going to kill them.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of growing season left out of it. So you got to be kind of cognizant of where you're growing them and why. And so with corn, you definitely don't want to run completely out of growing days. And if you live, down in the deep south, you got a lot longer planting windows than some people. But like you said, you got to be thinking about rainfall. When do we start drying up? And traditionally stop getting those really steady rains. To where you don't want your corn getting planted the second, third week of July, and then it gets one rain on it, and then it doesn't get another one for 6 weeks. It's going to make it pretty tough to grow some corn. So, it's got a long growing season for a lot of people, but you have to get it in time for it to get the weather that it needs to produce.
Yeah, and I guess it's just a fine line, because you want to have good conditions, but you also don't want to have it ready out there for 2.5 months before you can bow hunt over it. So.
That's
I'll
right.
be gone.
That's right. Because every other critter seems to like corn too, the coons and bears and hogs, and that's another thing. A lot of people just if you're dealing with hogs, just know you may have to fence it off or do something, or like I've done a few times before. If I know I've got hogs and I'm going to plant corn, then I'm going to be ready and set up to trap when that stuff is ready to start making its getting into that soft stage where they really like to get in there on it. Yeah. That way I can bait them up and catch them somewhere right when that corn, kind of like trapping coons just prior to nesting season. Mm-hmm. I know I may not be able to make a difference in the overall picture of the number of hogs that are, tearing up a county, but I can remove a sounder or two that's going to affect my cornfield or my chufa patch or whatever it is right at the time where I need it to be, safe.
Yeah.
So something to think about.
Yeah. Well, man, I won't hold you up any longer. There's a ton of things that I want to talk to you about. We'll have to work out a time where I can get you back on here again, maybe later in the summer when it's time to start thinking about fall growing season and all that. But I sure appreciate you coming on, and I'm going to let you know how the corn growing goes for me. So
yeah, man, keep in touch. Holler at us if you need anything, but I appreciate you having me on.
I'll do it, and I appreciate y'all listening, and I don't have anything else, so we will see y'all in 2 weeks.